Every organisation today is changing, restructuring. There's new technology, mergers, growth, budget pressure, new leadership. Change isn't a project anymore. It's just what organisational life looks like now. And because of that, we've become very good at managing it. Strategy, structures, systems, the technology, communication, timelines. We've got risk registers and implementation plans and stakeholder maps. All of it matters. I'm not here to argue against any of that. But after 30 years working across recruitment, leadership development, and organisational transformation, I've come to believe we're solving the wrong problem. Because people don't experience change through project plans, they experience it through themselves, through what it means about them, about where they sit, about whether they're still needed. Here's what I mean. In every organisational change I've supported, people are quietly asking themselves the same 5 questions. Where do I fit? What do I want? Am I still valued? Do I belong? Is there still a future for me here? Nobody asks those out loud in a town hall. They ask themselves those questions in the car on the way home. And notice, none of them are operational questions, they're identity questions. So that's not change, that's human transition. And human transition is the thing we almost never plan for. I learned this during the university merger. On paper, it covered all the change management processes, new structures, new reporting lines, new leadership, town halls, communication plans, and project teams. Everything a change program is supposed to have. But the conversations I was having every day with people sounded nothing like the project plan. Nobody I coached sat down and asked me about the org chart. I thought I was coaching people through organisational change. I wasn't. I was helping people reconnect with themselves. Here's where the gap shows up. Leaders are watching their people, and what they see is resistance, withdrawal, silence, stress, poor performance. And they respond to exactly that with more communication, more training, sometimes a performance conversation, because they're reading the behaviour literally. I sit with those same people one on one, and what I see is completely different. Uncertainty, identity disruption, loss of confidence, loss of belonging, loss of authority. And what I mean by that is they're no longer trusting their own judgment. Same behaviour, completely different cause, and therefore a completely different response. So let me translate. What looks like resistance is often uncertainty. What looks like disengagement is often exhaustion. And what looks like poor performance is often identity disruption. That's a very different conversation to have with someone. So let me define what I mean by that, because this is the heart of it. Identity disruption happens when people lose connection with who they are, when everything around them is changing. And it's rarely dramatic. Nobody walks into work and announces, hey, I've lost my confidence. It happens silently. They start second guessing themselves. They stop putting their hand up. They ask for reassurance on decisions they used to make every day. And they stop contributing ideas. They become careful, compliant, and eventually invisible. And by the time it's visible to the leader, it's usually been going on for months. So this is the distinction I ask you to hold on to. Organisations can change structures, but people change identities. One takes a decision, the other takes time. You can launch a new structure on a Monday, but it might take someone 6 months to work out who they are inside of it. Transition happens at human speed, not project speed. Which brings me to measurement. We measure things like completion, communications, engagement scores, training, adoption, and all of that tells you whether the project has happened, but none of it tells you about belonging, confidence levels, psychosocial safety, identity, or trust. None of it tells you who's quietly given up. So when we talk about the cost of change, we usually talk about burnout, turnover, absenteeism, things like that. But those aren't the cost. Those are the outcomes. By the time someone resigns, that resignation didn't start that week. It may have started 6 months ago, the day they stopped believing that they really mattered or belonged. That's the hidden cost, and it's completely invisible on a project dashboard. So, what actually helps? Well, over the last years, I've noticed people move through uncertainty far better when they reconnect with themselves. And that work typically lands in four distinct parts: reconnecting, rebuilding, realigning, and then re engaging. And it starts with clarity, but not the kind you're expecting. We usually can't give people certainty about the organisation and the future. What we can always do, though, is help them to get clear about themselves. An example of the power of reconnecting and rebuilding was when I was working with a senior executive whose sense of value had been deeply challenged during a significant restructure, and she was thinking of leaving. It brought up an old belief that she wasn't good enough. Through our coaching, she recognised the belief had come from a culture she'd grown up in, when girls were expected to stay in the background and not have a voice. Yet, this was a moment in her career when she really needed to use hers. Once she saw that connection, she could separate the old story from the present situation and reconnect with who she was. She rebuilt self trust and stepped forward with far greater confidence. A different example that enabled realignment and re engagement to occur was where I was working with people in a project management office who'd stepped away from the usual roles to work in a demanding but rewarding environment for an extended period of time. And as the project neared completion, many were worried about returning to roles they no longer felt would be engaging. Through workshops and coaching, they became clearer about their values and their strengths and the conditions that help them thrive. From there, they could see what they needed to integrate back into the broader workforce that would keep them growing and contributing rather than feeling like they were shifting down gears in their career. So imagine leaders recognising identity disruption early instead of at the exit interview, if ever. Imagine the conversations changing and imagine people feeling safe enough to say what's actually going on. Imagine people staying and being engaged. Imagine change becoming something people move through and get stronger through instead of something they merely survive. Not because the change got easier, but because people got stronger. And this is the part I'd really like to leave you with. Human transition creates organisational resilience, not the other way around. So if your organisation is going through a restructure or a merger or workforce transformation or change of leadership even, perhaps the greatest risk isn't your implementation plan. Perhaps it's what the change is quietly doing to your people. I'd love to have that conversation with you because organisational change is going to keep happening. We know that. That's not in question. The only question is how your people experience it. Because change doesn't just disrupt structures, it disrupts identity.